The sun was bleeding into the horizon, painting the desert in shades of fire and copper, as the old ranch gate groaned under the wind. Dust swirled across the worn path, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and old timber. A figure appeared in the distance, broad-shouldered, boots kicking up dirt with each step, his hat shadowing a face set with determination. The words escaped him in a low, dangerous growl that seemed to ride the wind itself. "Open the gate." "I'm coming in." His voice was gravel and steel, and it carried a promise that no one could ignore. The ranch, a stubborn stretch of land clinging to life in the unforgiving plains, had seen its share of fights, deals, and broken dreams, but nothing like what was about to unfold. On the other side of the fence, a smaller figure moved with careful precision, alert to the approach of the man whose reputation ran like wildfire through the county. The Apache warrior, tall and lean, stood with a wary calm that hid a storm beneath his skin. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, tracked every movement, every twitch in the dust and shadows, waiting, calculating. Inside the ranch house, tension sat like a living thing. A young woman, the sister of the warrior, tended to her chores, unaware of the danger threading its way toward the porch. Her hands moved over the fabric, adjusting, smoothing, unaware of the approaching storm. She had grown up in this land, learning to read the wind and the sky, but she had never faced a presence like this. Every instinct she had screamed that trouble was near, that the quiet she had known since dawn was about to shatter. The rancher's boots hit the wooden planks with a deliberate force that rattled the old boards, announcing his arrival even before he reached the gate. His eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and unyielding, like the edge of a blade. There was history in the way he moved, in the way he spoke, a history forged in land disputes, cattle drives, and the kind of grudges that lasted lifetimes. The wind seemed to bend around him as if nature itself recognized the weight he carried, the authority he demanded. The Apache warrior felt the tension tighten in his chest. He had seen this man before, in passing, in rumors whispered over campfires and around saloons. He knew the kind of danger a man like that carried, the way he could twist a moment, turn it into chaos with a single motion or word. His hands were steady, but his mind raced, tracing every possibility, every consequence. Every muscle in his body was ready for what might come next, a silent warning humming through his blood. A voice called from the porch, careful and steady, but carrying an undercurrent of warning. "He's here," the sister said, her tone measured but her eyes sharp. She knew the man who approached, knew the history that had tangled their families for generations. Yet even as her words passed, a flicker of something unreadable crossed her face, a mixture of fear, defiance, and a spark of courage that had been carved into her by years surviving the desert, by years knowing the stakes of this land. The rancher's shadow fell long across the ground as he finally reached the gate. His hands gripped the wood, the metal creaking under his fingers as he pushed it open. Every step closer was a statement, every movement a warning that he was not here to negotiate. The sun dipped lower, sending the long shadows of the buildings and fence stretching across the dirt like fingers reaching for something just beyond grasp. In that moment, the tension was nearly tangible, a living thing that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the approaching confrontation. Inside, the warrior adjusted his stance, positioning himself between the rancher and his sister. He was aware of the history, the unspoken code of honor that ran through his people, and the stubborn pride of those who had claimed this land before him. This was more than a confrontation. It was a collision of worlds, a test of wills where neither could afford to yield. The desert held its breath as the distance closed, the wind carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and leather, mixing with the undercurrent of danger that seemed to hang over the property like a storm cloud ready to burst. The sister's hands tightened around the hem of her dress, a gesture of instinct more than thought, as she stepped closer to her brother. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the way his body was coiled like a spring ready to release. Every sound, every shift in the wind, every snap of a branch beneath a hoof or boot was catalogued in her mind. She knew the stakes, knew that this encounter could change everything in an instant. The sun was now a low, burning eye over the ridge, casting the desert in hues of orange and blood, as if the land itself knew the fight to come. The rancher's voice broke the silence, firm, deliberate. I didn't come this far to be turned away. His gaze cut across the space between them, taking in the warrior, taking in the land, measuring, judging. There was no hesitation in his tone, only resolve, a relentless drive that had carried him across plains, rivers, and history to this exact point. He was a man who knew what he wanted and would take it, a force of nature tempered by stubborn pride and experience earned in the hardest way possible. The Apache warrior's eyes narrowed, reading the intent, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had trained for confrontation, for the defense of his family, for the survival of his people in a world that often sought to push them aside. Every instinct screamed caution, every sense sharpened to a fine edge. Yet, even in the heat of this tense standoff, he could not ignore the unspoken truths threading through the situation, the history, the grudges, the fragile balance of power, and the danger that was more than physical, more than just a clash of fists or firepower. As the rancher took another step forward, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a distant threat, the rustle of trees, the soft clatter of a gate hinge that could signal disaster. Time seemed to slow for a heartbeat. Each motion amplified the weight of every decision, every word, every gesture hanging in the balance. The warrior felt the heat of the sun on his back, the sweat starting to bead at his brow, the tension coiling tighter around his chest. He was ready for what might come, but he knew this encounter could unravel faster than anyone expected, that a single misstep could ignite a chain reaction that no one could control. The sister watched, heart pounding, as the distance closed. Her mind raced with strategies, contingencies, the stories she had been told about the harshness of men like him and the unpredictability of the land they lived on. She had learned to be resourceful, to trust her instincts, to rely on her brother's strength, but also to prepare for the moment when she might have to act herself. The tension was nearly unbearable, the air thick with anticipation, the desert around them a silent witness to the brewing storm. Finally, the rancher stopped, mere feet from the threshold of the house. His gaze swept over the land, the buildings, the figures before him, and a slow, calculated grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. He spoke again, each word deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of intent. "I warned you. I'm not leaving without what's owed." His tone left no room for misunderstanding, no space for negotiation. The ground seemed to tremble under the pressure of his presence, and the wind whispered of coming conflict, a storm ready to break over the desert plains. The Apache warrior stepped slightly forward, protective, unyielding. He was the line between danger and the woman who mattered to him, the one who held the legacy of their family, the one whose presence alone was enough to make a man like the rancher pause. Every muscle in his body was taut, every sense alert to the slightest movement. He was ready, but he knew readiness was only part of survival. Judgment, timing, and instinct would decide the outcome, and he had to trust in all three. The sister's gaze flicked between the men, weighing, calculating, aware that a single wrong move could tip the balance and ignite a confrontation neither could afford. Her hands gripped the fabric in front of her, not out of fear, but as a gesture of readiness, a way to anchor herself against the chaos that might erupt in an instant. She understood the stakes, the history, and the fragile truce that had held until now, and she knew that the next moments would shape everything to come. And then, with a sudden motion, the rancher pushed the gate fully open, the sound cutting through the silence like a shot. Dust swirled violently, catching the sunlight in sharp streaks as the wind seemed to rush in behind him. The Apache warrior moved instinctively, placing himself between his sister and the intruder, every nerve taut with anticipation. The desert held its breath, the land itself poised on the edge of what could only be described as inevitable conflict. In that suspended moment, the tension was absolute. The rancher's eyes burned with intent, the warrior's muscles coiled with defense, and the sister's heartbeat matched the rhythm of the approaching storm. No words could alter what was coming, no gesture could change the charge that filled the air. Every instinct, every story, every warning had led to this point. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long, unforgiving shadows across the land, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test loyalty, courage, and the very limits of survival. The wind carried a single whisper across the dust-swept plain, A warning or perhaps a promise, but it was lost in the moment. Everything hung on the edge, and the desert watched silently as two forces faced each other, each unwilling to yield, each aware that what happened next could not be undone. The sun sank into the horizon, leaving only the fading glow of red and gold, and the rancher's hand lingered near his belt, his eyes locked on the warrior. The Apache warrior held his ground, every breath measured, every muscle ready. The sister, caught in the center of a storm not of her making, could only watch as the first move was about to be made, knowing that the world she had known was on the brink of irreversible change. The moment stretched, taut as a drawn bow, as the final sunbeam flickered and died. The land seemed to hold its breath. The wind stilled. And then, in that perfect silence, the rancher spoke again, a single word, low and dangerous, carrying the weight of what was to come, leaving everything unresolved, hanging on the knife's edge of destiny. The desert waited, knowing the storm had only begun. The wind had fallen, leaving the ranch under a heavy silence that pressed down on the land like a living weight. The rancher's shadow stretched across the dirt, long and unbroken, as though the land itself was reluctant to accept his intrusion. The Apache warrior remained rigid, eyes locked on the intruder, muscles coiled with the precision of a panther ready to strike. Every line of the ranch house, every fence post, every ridge on the horizon seemed sharper, edged with tension, as if the earth itself could feel the history echoing between the two men. The young woman behind her brother's back adjusted the folds of her dress, a gesture more out of habit than purpose, though it was a subtle signal to her own nerves. She had grown up on this land, understanding the rhythms of the seasons, the behavior of men, and the way danger often came in quiet steps rather than loud displays. But this man was different. She had heard the stories whispered in town and on distant ranches, the way he barged into disputes, the way he took what he wanted, the way he left a trail of fear long after he had gone. He was a storm that could not be predicted, and now he stood at her doorstep. Her brother's mind drifted briefly to the history that had brought them here. The land had been in their family for generations, claimed long before settlers had crossed into this territory. Every fence post, every well, every corner of the property carried the sweat, blood, and pride of his ancestors. Yet the rancher's family had pressed closer with every passing season, buying claims, taking livestock, and staking rights that blurred the line between law and force. The tension had been simmering for years, growing beneath the surface until now, when it boiled over with the arrival of the man who refused to wait. The rancher shifted slightly, one boot catching on a loose board, but he did not falter. His hand rested lightly on the side of his holster, though no one could say if the motion was instinct, threat, or just preparation. His eyes were sharp, cold, and calculating, scanning the area as if he had already played out the next steps a dozen times in his mind. He knew the stories too, knew about the warrior, knew about the sister who had grown strong under the harsh sun and the harsher lessons of the land. Yet he had no hesitation, no thought of retreat. He was a man who had long since accepted that some battles were won by force alone. The Apache warrior remembered the day the rancher's men had first crossed the creek, cutting through his pasture, staking claims that did not belong to them. The confrontation had been brief, words exchanged over the roar of cattle and the scrape of spurred boots, but the memory was etched into his mind like a scar. He had learned early that this man did not respond to caution or diplomacy. Only readiness and strategy could keep him from taking more than he had been invited to claim. And now, standing on the threshold of the family home, the threat had become immediate, personal, unavoidable. The young woman's heart thudded in her chest, a rhythm she barely recognized as she watched the exchange. She had never feared her brother, never doubted his ability to defend her, but she understood the weight of history, the danger of a man who moved with certainty and had the stubborn pride to match her own family's. Her hands tightened around a piece of cloth she had been folding, and her mind raced through every story she had heard about confrontations like this, every tale that had warned her of the unpredictability of those who wielded authority without mercy. She was ready to step into the chaos if needed, but she prayed it would not come to that. The rancher's voice broke the silence again, low and deliberate. "You can't hold this land forever. Sooner or later, Someone with more guts than you is going to walk in and take what's theirs. Each word carried the weight of history, the implication of threats past and the promise of conflict. The Apache warrior did not respond immediately. He knew that words were weapons as sharp as bullets when used at the right time, and he weighed the man's tone carefully. He could feel the tension in the air thickening, every movement of the wind, every shift in light, every distant call of a hawk magnifying the stakes. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had slowed. The dust motes drifted lazily in the sunlight, catching the last of the day's glow. The rancher's presence seemed to press down on the land, compressing it into a tension that could snap at any second. The warrior's mind flicked to the broader picture, the encroachment of settlers, the erosion of ancestral lands, the slow march of claims and contracts that ignored the living history of the people who had lived and worked this land for generations. The conflict here was a spark on a tinderbox that had been decades in the making. The sister's gaze darted from one man to the other, understanding for the first time the full weight of the moment. This was not just a clash of two stubborn wills. It was a collision of past grievances, unspoken histories, and the stubborn insistence of pride that neither side could easily set aside. She remembered her father's voice, stern and patient, warning her of outsiders who did not respect the land, who did not understand the ties that bound her family to every rock and ridge. She also remembered the tales of warriors like her brother, who had defended their own with a dedication that bordered on obsession. Now, in the space of a single afternoon, both forces had converged at the edge of the family home, and she realized that the outcome would shape more than just her family's immediate future. The rancher shifted his stance, one hand brushing against the brim of his hat. His eyes, hard as flint, studied the landscape as if measuring not only the land, but the resolve of the people who defended it. He had come prepared for resistance, yet he had underestimated the presence of the warrior's sister. Her quiet strength, the way she held herself with a calm confidence, hinted at a lineage of stubborn resilience that he had not accounted for. The tension between him and the warrior was already high, but the addition of another presence, unyielding and determined, raised the stakes further. The warrior's hand hovered near the hilt of his knife, a gesture of readiness more than threat. He had been trained to anticipate, to calculate the consequences of action, to respond with precision. Every inch of the land, every shadow in the yard, every step toward the gate was a variable in the equation he had been running in his mind since the rancher's arrival. He could not allow emotion to dictate his choices, though the weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting. A distant dog barked, breaking the stillness momentarily, and the sound seemed amplified in the silence that followed. The rancher's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to the warrior, and a flicker of a smile crossed his face, one that did not reach his eyes. He was testing, probing, seeking weaknesses in a line that had stood for generations. He knew the stakes and he knew the terrain, yet he moved forward with a deliberate, calculated disregard for caution. The sister stepped lightly behind her brother, her hands brushing against the rough wood of the porch railing. She felt the pulse of the land beneath her feet, the energy of years of history coursing through the ground, and she drew strength from it. She had grown up with stories of courage and cunning, of resilience and ingenuity, and she knew that sometimes survival depended on more than brute force. She had learned to read the signs, to anticipate the moves of men like the rancher, and to act decisively when the moment called for it. The rancher's boots crunched against the dirt as he moved closer to the house, and with each step the past seemed to press harder against the present. The history of encroachment, of claims and counterclaims, of fights won and lost, weighed on the land, and the tension was a reflection of that weight. The warrior stood firm, every sense alert, every breath measured, while his sister watched silently, ready for the moment when action would become inevitable. A faint flicker of movement at the edge of the property caught the warrior's attention. It was a small shadow, almost imperceptible, but it spoke of something beyond the immediate conflict. Something unseen, something that had watched, waited, and now moved in response to the presence of the rancher. The feeling of being observed was not new. The land was old and alive, and those who lived upon it knew that other eyes often followed. Yet the sense of an additional force, something neither man could fully see, added another layer of tension to the confrontation. The rancher paused for a fraction of a second, as though sensing the same shift. His gaze scanned the horizon, his instincts honed over years of navigating the unpredictable West warning him of unseen danger, yet he did not flinch. He had faced storms, bandits, and rival families before, and he knew that hesitation could be more dangerous than outright confrontation. His confidence was a shield, yet it could not hide the subtle awareness that the world around him was not entirely under his control. The young woman's mind raced, weighing the possible dangers. She knew her brother could handle most threats, but she also understood the unpredictability of men who believed the land and its people were theirs to command. She considered the history of their family, the stories of courage, cunning, and survival that had shaped her, and she realized that the moment ahead required every lesson she had ever learned. Every instinct, every memory, every story was now part of her preparation. The sun dipped lower, leaving the desert painted in twilight reds and purples. Shadows stretched across the ground, blurring the line between the seen and unseen, the known and the unknown. The rancher's hand hovered near his side, the faint outline of a weapon visible in the dimming light. The warrior adjusted his stance, feet planted firmly, every muscle ready, every sense alert. The sister took a step forward, silently, a quiet reminder that she was not just a bystander but a part of the defense, part of the balance that would determine what happened next. The wind stirred once more, carrying a distant, faint sound, barely more than a whisper over the desert floor. It was enough to remind them that the land was alive, that every step, every breath, every motion was part of a larger story that had been unfolding long before any of them arrived. History, pride, survival, and the raw reality of human determination converged in the fading light, leaving the trio poised on the edge of confrontation, aware that the next move would not just decide the day, but could change everything for generations to come. And in that suspended moment, the rancher's eyes met the warrior's. Both men aware of the weight between them, both men knowing that retreat was impossible and victory was uncertain. The sister stood at the center, calm but alert, a living bridge between two forces shaped by history, land, and pride. The desert, timeless and unyielding, seemed to lean in, waiting for what would come, carrying the promise of danger and the hint of secrets yet to be revealed. The horizon darkened as the first stars began to pierce the twilight. The air was thick with anticipation, and the faintest rustle of movement at the edge of the property reminded them that they were not alone in this unfolding story. Something watched, something waited, and the rancher's low, deliberate words hung in the silence, a challenge and a warning, leaving everything unresolved, every tension still coiled tight, ready to snap. The desert held its breath, the land itself aware that history, pride, and the unpredictable nature of men were about to collide. The rancher shifted again, deliberate, careful, but ready to act. The Apache warrior tightened his grip on his knife, eyes sharp, muscles taut. His sister, heart steady, despite the storm of emotions within, readied herself for the inevitable, knowing that this moment was only the beginning. The night was closing in, and the outcome was still uncertain, leaving the land, the ranch, and the people standing upon it suspended between danger and destiny. The rancher's boots pressed into the soft dirt with a deliberate rhythm, each step carrying a weight that seemed to echo the history of every claim, dispute, and fight that had come before. The Apache warrior shifted slightly, eyes never leaving the man's figure, reading the posture, the tilt of his shoulders, the subtle tightening of his jaw. He knew this confrontation was not just about the present moment. It was about decades of tension, about pride and inheritance, about the stubborn will of families who refused to yield. Each man represented more than himself. They were living embodiments of legacies that had been carved into the land itself. The sister remained just behind her brother, but she was far from passive. Her sharp eyes scanned the property, noticing details that might have seemed insignificant to others, the loose fence rail near the corral, the low branches of the mesquite that could hide someone's approach, the glint of a distant metal bucket catching the last light of day. She had grown up learning that the desert was never empty, that danger often arrived quietly, and that survival required awareness, preparation, and the courage to act. Her mind worked like a map, calculating possibilities, plotting responses, and anticipating the rancher's next move. The rancher paused, resting one hand on the gatepost. His eyes flicked briefly toward the house, toward the open windows, and then back to the warrior. "You've held this land a long time," he said, low, almost conversational, "but long enough is a dangerous kind of pride. It makes men blind to what's coming." His words were measured, but they carried a sharp edge. He was speaking not only to the warrior, but to the story of the land itself, a warning that history had a way of repeating itself, often with more violence each time. The warrior's jaw tightened. He remembered every encounter, every minor skirmish that had tested patience and resolve. He had faced men with guns, men with grudges, men who believed authority gave them the right to take without consequence. And yet, this man was different. He was not only a threat in the moment, he was a reminder that the world outside the borders of the land they had fought to protect was growing bolder, more relentless, and increasingly unwilling to respect the bonds that had always held the family's territory together. From the edge of the corral, a sound shifted the tension, a soft nicker of a horse, restless in the growing shadows. The sister's head turned slightly, catching the noise before anyone else, and she allowed herself the faintest of smiles, knowing that even the animals on this land were aware that something was stirring. The rancher noticed the movement, too, eyes narrowing. He could see her presence, her alertness, and it added another layer to the puzzle he was trying to solve. This wasn't a simple confrontation between two men. The dynamics of family, loyalty, and knowledge of the land were all part of the equation. The warrior's mind flicked to the past, to the lessons taught by his father and uncles. Lessons about strategy, about reading intentions before words were spoken, about knowing the land so intimately that every ridge, every tree, every shadow could provide an advantage. He recalled the stories of earlier disputes, of men who had underestimated his family's resolve and paid for it in ways that became legend. The rancher may have had confidence, may have had presence, but he lacked one key advantage: a complete understanding of the land and its history. The sister, sensing the growing edge of tension, stepped closer to her brother. She had learned to trust instincts above all else. Years of surviving the harsh desert had taught her that danger was rarely announced, that it often arrived in moments like this, slowed, stretched, laden with the weight of unspoken consequences. She could see the rancher's eyes flicker as he calculated, and she understood the quiet intimidation he wielded. It was a tool, a way to assert presence and test resolve. Yet she also knew that resolve could be stronger than intimidation when backed by knowledge, courage, and determination. The rancher tilted his head slightly, his voice carrying again, slow and deliberate. "This isn't just about a few acres of dirt," he said. "It's about control. It's about making sure no one stands in the way of what's theirs. I don't waste time with hesitation." Each word was chosen to unsettle, to measure the reaction, to see whether the warrior would crack under the weight of implied threat. But the warrior did not move, did not respond in words. His silence was its own weapon, a statement of presence and readiness, a refusal to give the rancher any advantage. The sister's gaze flicked toward the horizon, to the ridges that framed the property. She noticed the faint outline of dust rising in the distance, the subtle shimmer of heat waves off the plain. It was possible, she thought, that more was coming, others who had been watching, waiting for the opportunity to strike or to intervene. The desert was vast, but the stakes narrowed every step, every approach measured, every shadow a potential threat. Her mind raced through contingency plans, ways to protect herself, her brother, and the legacy of the land that had been entrusted to her family. The rancher shifted his weight, and the low creak of the gate hanging on its hinges broke the silence. He stepped closer, and the weight of his presence seemed to press down on the Apache warrior, who remained vigilant. Every detail mattered: the angle of the sun, the position of the shadows, the texture of the dirt underfoot, the way the wind could carry sound and scent. These were not idle observations, they were survival, and the warrior had spent his life mastering them. The sister moved slightly, careful, deliberate, as if her presence alone could help tilt the balance. She had grown up knowing that her role was not always one of direct confrontation, but of awareness, communication, and readiness. She had seen her brother navigate threats, had watched him respond to moments of sudden violence with precision and calm. Now, as the rancher's approach drew closer, she realized that her own role might become more active than ever before. The rancher paused again, eyes sweeping the property, the house, the corral, the surrounding land. There was a history in his movements, a sense that he had calculated each step, but also an unpredictability that made him dangerous. He spoke again, deliberately, measured, his voice carrying across the yard. "You can't hold the past against the future forever," he said. "Sooner or later, the land calls for change. You can fight it, or you can be swept aside." The Apache warrior did not respond. He did not need to. His stance, his steady gaze, his readiness spoke volumes. He had inherited a legacy of defense, of knowing when to strike and when to hold, of protecting those who could not fight for themselves. He understood that the rancher's words were more than threats. They were tests, attempts to unsettle, to measure whether fear could be bred with tone alone. But fear had no place here, not when history, pride, and survival were on the line. The sister felt the tension coil tighter, like the tightening of a rope under strain. She had watched her brother through countless trials, seen him meet challenges head-on, and she understood the weight he carried in these moments. But she also understood the stakes of this particular encounter. It was not only a matter of land, it was a matter of pride, of legacy, and of the fragile balance that had kept both families in check. One misstep, one wrong calculation, and the confrontation could spiral beyond control. From the distance, the faint sound of hooves became audible, the rhythm irregular, almost hesitant. The sister's eyes narrowed, and her hand tightened against the railing. Others were near, watching, waiting. The desert had always been alive with hidden eyes and hidden threats, and she had learned to recognize the signs long before they became immediate danger. The arrival of additional watchers added another layer of tension, another variable in the equation of survival that the warrior and his family had to consider. The rancher shifted his weight, sensing the undercurrent, though he could not see it clearly. His eyes, trained for threats and opportunity, scanned the land instinctively. Yet he moved forward without hesitation, confident in his presence, in the force he represented, and in the advantage of being the aggressor. The Apache warrior, aware of the growing complexity, adjusted his stance slightly, ready to respond, ready to act, and ready to defend the land and the family in ways that the rancher could not anticipate. The sister felt the air thicken, a prelude to action. She could sense the history pressing down on them, the grudges, the unspoken rules of survival, and the pressure of immediate danger. Her mind raced, connecting past lessons to present challenges, and she realized that the confrontation was about more than just the land. It was about respect, about the weight of family legacy, about survival in a world where strength and cunning determined who endured. The rancher's hand brushed against the side of his belt again, a subtle signal that he was prepared for more than words. The warrior's fingers twitched, not in fear but in anticipation, ready to defend, ready to respond, ready to do what history and instinct demanded. The sister's eyes flicked to the shadows around the property, to the edges of the corral, to the ridge beyond the house, aware that the confrontation might not remain limited to the three of them. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the desert in the dim glow of twilight. Every movement seemed magnified, every sound sharper, every shadow heavier. The rancher and the warrior remained locked in a silent contest, measuring each other with presence, posture, and the weight of history. The sister, poised between them, understood that the land, the family, and the legacy were all in that moment suspended, waiting for the first move, the first misstep, the first spark that could ignite the next chapter of a story that had been decades in the making. And then, just as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, a sudden shift of motion at the edge of the corral caught all three of them, the faintest ripple of dust, a shadow that moved faster than any horse or human should have been capable of. The air tensed like a wire pulled too tight, and in that instant the desert seemed to hold its breath. History, pride, and danger converged, and every heartbeat counted. The rancher's eyes widened fractionally, the warrior's muscles coiled, and the sister's hand moved instinctively, knowing that the moment of confrontation was no longer just imminent, it had already begun. The unknown watcher in the shadows remained unseen, but its presence shifted the balance, adding another layer of uncertainty to a confrontation already teetering on the edge of chaos. The rancher stepped forward, slow, deliberate, ready to assert control. The warrior adjusted his stance, every movement calculated, every breath steady, every sense alert. The sister's gaze swept across the yard, the corral, the horizon, her mind racing through every contingency. The tension thickened, history pressed harder, and the land itself seemed to wait for the inevitable clash that could determine the fate of all involved. The wind stirred again, carrying the faintest scent of smoke and dust. The rancher's hand lingered near his side, the weight of authority, threat, and intent hanging heavy in the cooling air. The warrior's eyes narrowed, catching the subtle shift in light and shadow, aware that the balance had changed, that an unseen force had entered the game. The sister drew a slow breath, centering herself, preparing for whatever was coming, understanding that the moment had grown far more complex, far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. The desert, the land, and the night seemed to press in from all sides, leaving the three figures poised on the knife edge of uncertainty. Every instinct, every lesson, every piece of history came into play as they faced each other. The rancher, confident yet unaware of the full scope of forces at play. The Apache warrior, vigilant, prepared, and resolute. The sister, alert, aware, and ready to act in ways that might tip the balance. And somewhere, beyond the edges of sight, the shadow waited, patient, unseen, a reminder that danger was rarely straightforward, and that survival depended on more than strength alone. The horizon darkened further, and the first stars punctured the twilight sky like distant eyes. The rancher's gaze flicked one last time toward the horizon, then back to the warrior, each man measuring the other, both aware that what came next could reshape everything. The sister's hand tightened on the railing, a silent signal that she would not be passive, that she would act if necessary, that she understood the stakes in a way that transcended fear. And the desert waited, timeless and unyielding, knowing that the first move, the first spark, the first step toward the inevitable was about to come. The tension was absolute, every detail sharpened, every instinct engaged. And in that silence, heavy and unbroken, the next chapter of the conflict hung poised, unresolved, brimming with danger, history, and the promise of action that would not allow them to remain on the threshold any longer. The desert night had fully claimed the ranch, leaving the landscape bathed in pale silver moonlight that stretched across the yard in long, thin shadows. The rancher's figure was sharp against the fading glow, his silhouette framed by the gate and the open plains beyond. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, boots pressing into the dry earth with the kind of authority born from years of claiming what others thought untouchable. Every step seemed calculated, every pause a test, every gesture an assertion that he would not be denied. The Apache warrior tightened his stance, sensing the shift in the air, the almost imperceptible tightening of muscles and tension that came with a confrontation about to ignite. The desert seemed alive, every shadow a threat, every rustle a signal that time was growing short. He had faced men like this before, but the combination of pride, cunning, and unyielding determination in the rancher was something different. It demanded more than strength, it demanded patience, instinct, and a readiness for anything the night might bring. The sister remained behind her brother, her eyes sharp and moving constantly. She had grown up knowing that danger rarely announced itself clearly. It came in quiet steps, in half-seen movements and whispers carried by the wind. She could feel the weight of history pressing against her chest, the land her family had worked, the ancestors who had fought to protect it, and the persistent threat of outsiders who did not understand the value of legacy. Every instinct in her body screamed that the moment was about to snap, that the calm of the desert night was a fragile thing that could shatter with a single move. The rancher paused near the corral, resting one hand lightly against the gatepost. His eyes scanned the area, noting the position of the warrior, the subtle movements of the sister, the texture of the ground, and the distant ridges that framed the property. He spoke slowly, each word meant to probe, unsettle, and measure the reaction of those who opposed him. "I didn't come this far to be turned away," he said, low, deliberate. "The land waits for no one. Not for the stubborn, not for the proud." The warrior's jaw tightened. He remembered every encroachment, every attempt to stake claim on what had never belonged to the rancher, every moment when words and intimidation had been the only tools to protect the land. This confrontation was not merely about property, it was about respect, about history, about the unbroken chain of survival that stretched across generations. He shifted slightly, ready aware that the rancher's words were as much a challenge as a declaration, and that any misstep could tip the delicate balance into open conflict. The sister's hand brushed against the railing of the porch, steadying herself. She had grown up watching her brother defend their family, their land, and now she could sense the moment drawing closer when words alone would not suffice. The tension in the air was palpable, like the wire of a bow pulled taut, waiting for release. She understood that she might have to act, to make decisions in the blink of an eye that could mean survival or disaster. Her mind raced through possibilities, tracing paths of movement, escape, and defense, each one weighted by risk and consequence. The rancher's eyes flicked toward the horizon, and for a brief moment, the faint glint of movement caught his attention. Something or someone was approaching from the distant ridge. He did not flinch, but the muscle in his jaw tightened ever so slightly. He knew the desert had eyes and ears, that other forces might be watching, waiting to see who would yield first. The presence of an unseen observer added another layer of tension, a reminder that the confrontation was not isolated, that the land held secrets and dangers beyond the immediate threat. The warrior noticed the shift too. His senses, honed by years of vigilance and survival, detected the subtle changes, the soft rustle of boots over stone, the flicker of a shadow in the corner of his vision, the slight change in the wind's direction. Every movement was a potential threat, every sound a signal. He adjusted his stance, drawing himself taller, coiling readiness into every muscle. The rancher was a formidable adversary, but now the uncertainty of others lurking in the darkness complicated the picture, forcing him to balance defense with awareness beyond the immediate confrontation. The sister stepped closer to her brother, her presence silent but deliberate. She had never needed to fight openly, yet her awareness alone added weight to the warrior's position. Her calm under pressure, her understanding of the land, and her instinct for danger were tools as potent as any weapon. She could see the rancher measuring them, trying to gauge fear or hesitation, and she understood that she could provide a counterweight, a reminder that the family stood united, ready to meet force with resolve. The rancher shifted his weight, brushing dust from his boots. He spoke again, low and deliberate, his voice carrying across the silent desert. "You think pride can defend you. You think history will protect you? But time doesn't wait, and stubbornness can be broken." Each word was a calculated jab, meant to test the warrior's patience and judgment, meant to force a reaction that could reveal a weakness. Yet the warrior held firm, his silence a statement of unyielding defiance. The distant figure on the ridge moved closer, still obscured by the shadows. The sister's eyes flicked toward the movement, and she whispered a single word, barely audible over the dry wind. "Watch." Her tone carried urgency, the kind of warning that comes from instinct rather than calculation. The warrior's gaze shifted, his stance tightening further, muscles coiling like springs. The rancher noticed the movement in the corner of his vision, and a brief flicker of doubt passed through his confident posture. The desert held its breath as the distance closed. The moonlight illuminated the rancher's features, harsh and unyielding, while shadows hid the details of the approaching figure. Every element of the landscape seemed to heighten the suspense, the cracked boards of the corral, the low branches brushing the edge of the porch, the distant ridges that could conceal an ambush. The tension was absolute, every detail magnified, every second stretched to its limit, as if the night itself were holding the story poised on a knife's edge. The warrior moved slightly, shifting his weight, ready to intercept any threat. He had spent years preparing for moments like this, learning to read intent, to anticipate danger, to act decisively in situations where hesitation could mean loss. Every instinct screamed at him to watch for the unexpected, and he knew that the arrival of a new figure could change the balance in an instant. He was prepared for confrontation, yet he also knew that the first action would set the tone for everything that followed. The sister's hand lingered near the edge of the railing. She had grown up knowing the harsh lessons of the desert, learning that readiness was as much mental as physical. She could see the tension in the rancher, in her brother, and she felt the pulse of the land beneath her feet. She understood the magnitude of the moment, how easily it could tip into violence, how swiftly a single misstep could unravel years of careful survival. Yet she remained calm, alert, and ready, knowing that courage and timing were just as vital as strength. The rancher's voice broke the silence once more, carrying a deliberate cadence that seemed to echo across the plain. "I've come too far to turn back, and I'll not leave without what I've come for." The weight behind his words was unmistakable, an unspoken promise of action. His eyes scanned the property, taking in the warrior's stance, the sister's alertness, the shadows beyond, calculating every angle, every possible outcome. He was testing limits, probing defenses, and setting the stage for what was about to unfold. The distant figure grew closer, and the faint sound of movement became unmistakable, a subtle, almost ghostly presence blending with the wind and terrain. The sister's eyes narrowed, scanning the ridges, the fence lines, and the corral, anticipating the moment when this unknown force might act. She felt the weight of history, of family, of every lesson learned under the harsh desert sun pressing down on her shoulders. Every instinct urged her to act, yet patience was as vital as speed in this delicate balance of confrontation and survival. The warrior's gaze flicked between the rancher and the approaching shadow. He could feel the tension coiling tighter with each passing second, each breath a reminder that the moment of action was imminent. He adjusted his stance, ready to respond, ready to defend, aware that the first strike could change everything. The desert seemed alive with expectation, every rock, every shadow, every sound magnified as if the land itself understood the importance of what was about to unfold. The rancher's hand brushed the side of his holster, and a faint grin tugged at his lips. He had faced uncertainty before, yet there was a thrill in testing resolve, in pressing against the boundaries of another's determination. The presence of the warrior and his sister, combined with the unseen force on the ridge, created a tension that was almost tangible. Every step, every gesture, every flicker of movement carried meaning, carried consequence, carried the weight of a story that had been decades in the making. The sister's pulse quickened as the figure on the ridge became clearer. It moved with precision, deliberate and silent, suggesting knowledge of the terrain and a purpose that was unknown but unmistakably threatening. Her mind raced, evaluating strategies, predicting possibilities, preparing for the moment when action would become unavoidable. The warrior noticed her shift, recognizing the silent communication, the shared understanding that the next moments would test every lesson they had ever learned. The rancher's eyes followed her movement, and for a brief instant the confidence in his posture flickered. He had expected resistance, yes, but he had not anticipated the depth of coordination between the warrior and his sister, the way they moved and responded almost as a single unit. He adjusted slightly, recalculating, aware that the first action could tip the balance, that the unseen figure could alter the dynamic entirely. The desert held its breath, the night stretched taut with anticipation. The rancher took a measured step, deliberate, each movement calculated, each one meant to assert dominance and test the limits of resolve. The warrior shifted slightly in response, muscles coiled, senses sharpened, eyes locked on both the man before him and the shadow approaching from the ridge. The sister's hand hovered near the railing, ready to move with precision, ready to act when the first opportunity arose. Every heartbeat carried weight. Every movement was magnified in the pale light of the moon. Every sound, from the distant wind to the subtle shift of the dust, carried significance. The tension between the three human presences was already high, but the addition of the unknown force brought it to a near breaking point. History, pride, survival, and instinct converged in a single, suspended moment, leaving all three poised on the edge of action, aware that the first strike could set in motion a series of events that none of them could fully control. And as the final streaks of sunlight vanished behind the ridges, leaving the desert under a blanket of night, the three figures held their positions, every sense alert, every muscle coiled, every heartbeat a countdown. The rancher, the warrior, the sister, and the shadowed figure approaching were all bound together in a moment of suspense so intense that it seemed the land itself might shatter under the pressure. The next move would come soon, the first action would tip the balance, and the night held its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. The first motion came from the shadow on the ridge, a sudden rustle that sent the desert alive with tension. The rancher instinctively shifted his weight, hand brushing his holster, but the movement was intercepted by the warrior, who stepped forward with a controlled calm that belied the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The sister's eyes flicked between them, her breath steady despite the pounding rhythm of her heart. The moment that had stretched taut for hours finally snapped, and action was unavoidable. The figure descending from the ridge revealed itself to be a rider, not a threat as initially feared, but a messenger. Dust kicked up behind the horse, trailing like a ribbon of urgency. The rider came into full view, carrying a letter sealed with the mark of the county sheriff, a man known for his stubborn insistence on law and order in a land often ruled by the fastest draw. The rancher's gaze softened fractionally, and for the first time that evening, a trace of hesitation replaced the hard edges of his confidence. The warrior lowered his knife slightly but remained alert, recognizing that threats could come from any direction, and that trust was earned in moments like this. The sister stepped forward, reaching for the letter before the rider even dismounted, her hand steady. The seal was broken with deliberate care, revealing a message that would change the course of the confrontation. It was a notice, a mandate that the disputed land had been legally recognized as belonging to the warrior's family. The rancher's claim was invalid, and he was required to leave within a week or face lawful action. The wind picked up again, scattering dust and loose leaves across the yard, and the rancher's eyes met the warrior's with a mixture of resignation and respect. "Seems I miscalculated," he said, his voice steady but stripped of the authority it had carried only moments before. There was no malice now, only recognition of the facts and a reluctant acknowledgement of the warrior's steadfast defense. "You've held your ground well." "More than well." The sister exhaled quietly, a small relief passing through her body as the immediate tension began to ease. The night still carried the residue of danger, the echo of the long hours of suspense, but the worst of it had passed. She had learned over years of living on this land that relief often arrived quietly, without fanfare, and it was those quiet moments that allowed true reflection and understanding to take root. The rancher stepped back from the gate, his figure relaxing slightly as he studied the land one last time. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect, and nodded toward the siblings. "You've done what I could not, held the land and defended it without crossing the line into needless bloodshed. That's worth more than I can measure." His boots shifted on the hard ground, and he turned toward the open plains, the moonlight tracing his outline as he began the long walk back to his own land. The warrior finally allowed himself a slow exhale, letting the tension drain from his body. The knife at his side was no longer a necessity, but it remained a symbol of readiness, of the lessons learned through generations of survival. He glanced at his sister, seeing the faint smile that had crept onto her face, and knew that this night, with all its danger and uncertainty, had strengthened the bond between them even further. The shared understanding of responsibility, courage, and loyalty was more enduring than any fleeting confrontation. The sister moved closer, brushing dust from her dress, her hands steady and calm. She had played her part without hesitation, and the feeling of relief was tempered by pride. She understood now that courage was not only about facing danger head-on, but also about timing, judgment, and knowing when to act and when to hold back. The lessons of the night would stay with her, woven into the fabric of her own legacy alongside that of her brother and their ancestors. The desert settled into a quieter rhythm as the tension dissolved. The wind carried away the last echoes of confrontation, leaving only the soft murmurs of distant wildlife and the whisper of leaves across the sand. The ranch house, the corral, and the surrounding land seemed to exhale along with the siblings, as if the land itself was relieved that order had been restored without bloodshed. Every detail, the fence posts, the ridges, the shadows, stood witness to the resolution, a silent acknowledgement of the endurance, strength, and patience that had guided the night. The warrior walked slowly to the gate, glancing across the open land, making sure there was no immediate danger from the wider surroundings. The horizon was clear, the dust settling, and the moon casting silver light across the familiar terrain. The rancher was gone from sight, leaving the siblings alone, yet the weight of history remained. The land they had defended carried generations of memories, struggles, and triumphs, and the events of the evening had added another chapter to that enduring story. The sister stood beside her brother, her gaze sweeping the horizon. The night held a quiet majesty now, a sense of completion that came from conflict resolved without violence. She reflected on the importance of vigilance, of courage, and of understanding the stakes of both immediate action and long-term responsibility. Each moment had reinforced the lessons she had grown up learning, the value of family, the sanctity of land, and the strength found in unity and perseverance. The warrior nodded toward the house, and she followed him inside, their steps measured and calm. The interior was quiet, the familiar smells of home comforting in contrast to the tense desert air outside. Every piece of furniture, every artifact of daily life, carried history and familiarity, grounding them after hours spent navigating danger and uncertainty. It was a reminder that their fight had been about more than pride, it had been about preserving their way of life, their heritage, and the people they loved. Outside, the moon climbed higher, casting a serene light across the property. The corral was still, the animals settled, and the shadows that had once seemed threatening now simply marked the contours of the land. The night air was cool and carried a sense of calm, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the siblings and the rancher just hours before. There was a satisfaction in knowing that courage, patience, and readiness had ensured the land remained theirs, and that confrontation had been met with resolution rather than destruction. The sister moved to the window, looking out at the plains stretching into the distance. Her mind traced the events of the evening, the approach of the rancher, the shadow on the ridge, the tension that had almost spiraled into chaos. She realized that the most significant battles were not always fought with weapons alone, but with judgment, awareness, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. Each lesson would stay with her, guiding future decisions and shaping the legacy she and her brother would continue to uphold. The warrior joined her at the window, resting a hand on the railing inside the house. "It's over for now," he said quietly, the words carrying relief but also a note of caution. "The land is ours, but we've learned a lot tonight. We've seen what can happen if we underestimate what's out there." His voice was steady, calm, yet filled with the weight of experience. It was a reminder that vigilance, courage, and awareness would always be necessary, even after victory. The sister nodded, understanding the depth of his words. "We held our ground," she said, "and we did it together. That counts for more than just winning this fight. It counts for what comes next, for the land and for the people who rely on us." The shared understanding between them was palpable. It was the knowledge that they had preserved more than property, they had preserved history, pride, and the values that defined their family. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush and the distant aroma of the plains at night. The siblings listened to the rhythm of the desert, feeling the pulse of the land that had been their constant companion, their teacher, and their protector. The rancher was gone, but the lessons from this night remained, etched into memory like carvings in stone. They knew that the world beyond their property would continue to challenge them, but they also knew that courage, unity, and readiness would guide them through whatever came next. The night deepened, stars twinkling overhead in a vast, clear sky. The desert stretched endlessly, silent except for the occasional rustle of a nocturnal creature or the whisper of the wind. Inside the house, the siblings moved about, completing tasks with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned the value of preparedness and reflection. Every gesture was imbued with the understanding that life continued, that vigilance remained important, and that the experiences of the night had strengthened both resolve and character. As they prepared to settle for the night, the sister looked once more through the window, taking in the landscape that had been defended with courage and care. The fence lines, the corral, the distant ridges, all were reminders of what had been preserved through patience, strategy, and unyielding resolve. She felt a sense of pride, not only in the land but in the bond between her and her brother, and in the legacy that had been upheld against threat and challenge. The warrior finally turned from the window, casting one last glance across the property before stepping away. "We'll rest tonight," he said, "but tomorrow the work continues. The land, the family, and the people we protect, they depend on us." His tone carried quiet strength. a recognition that victory was both a moment of relief and a call to ongoing responsibility. The sister nodded, understanding that their journey was far from over, yet grateful for the resolution and the safety that had been secured. The house settled into quiet, the desert outside reflecting the calm that had replaced the tension. Every shadow, every ridge, every star overhead seemed to mark the end of a trial and the beginning of a renewed sense of purpose. The siblings felt the weight of responsibility lift slightly, replaced by pride, relief, and the knowledge that courage, strategy, and unity had preserved what mattered most. By the time the first light of dawn began to brush the horizon with pale gold, the ranch was peaceful. The wind carried away the remnants of the night, leaving only the solid presence of the land and the enduring legacy of those who had defended it. The rancher had gone, the threat had passed, and the siblings stood together, ready to face whatever came next with courage, awareness, and the quiet strength of people who understood the true meaning of family, land, and honor. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling warmth across the plains, the warrior and his sister moved through their home with steady purpose. Every glance outside, every task completed, carried the satisfaction of a conflict resolved without bloodshed, the knowledge that unity and courage had protected their legacy, and the quiet certainty that they were prepared for the challenges that the future would bring. The land was theirs, the family safe, and the lessons of the night would endure, a story of vigilance, strength, and triumph quietly etched into the fabric of their lives.